I'm Chip Pickering. I'm the CEO of INCOMPAS. We're the association that represents all of the leading fiber and wireless, satellite and technology companies across the country. We're united around promoting the deployment of next generation and advanced networks and promoting competition as we do so. I'm very glad to have two of the leaders of our industry and Uniti represented one of our great members, Ron Mudry, who serves on our board and on the executive committee of INCOMPAS and has just been a great contributor and leader for INCOMPAS. And then Robert Leithman, who is the VP of Education, Government, and Utilities, joining us today as we look at really what is a transformational moment for our industry, that the country, through the COVID crisis, has seen that broadband is really the indispensable, essential, irreplaceable service that our nation now needs more than ever. And our economy and our growth depend upon it. And the average citizen every day with their family, they need to have the connectivity and the ability to work, learn, have their health care from their home, from their office. And today's session, I think, will really give us an insight into this moment for broadband, where I think that the public policy leaders of our country on both sides of the aisle are making a tremendous commitment and making resources available to achieve connectivity for every American everywhere, and rural America in all corners of the country and underserved markets in the urban and suburban areas. So this is a tipping point or pivotal transformational moment in the history of the broadband industry. And so I'm very excited about the information that we have and that we'll go over today, that I think will be valuable to each of you that are looking at what is possible, what is available for your companies and the new entrants and the established companies in the broadband industry as we go forward, and the opportunities, I think, really for the first time in rural America to deploy networks in a way that will make economic sense when you have the federal funding that I believe in the state funding that is coming to the market. So with that, let me go quickly into the first slide and to talk a little bit about where we are in Congress and at the FCC with the existing policy and some of the policies that have recently passed into legislation, and some of the legislation that we believe will pass later this summer, and what that all entails. And so as you look at this slide, this ain't your mama's residential market. There are new economic drivers that make broadband investment economic and profitable. And as you look at the federal funding that's coming into the market, it is extremely significant. Robert will kind of detail exactly all the different fundings and the total funding, but approximately $165 billion in targeted programs that we'll go over today over the next 10 years to achieve rural broadband deployments to every community and every person in those communities that have historically been underserved as it relates to broadband and broadband choices and connectivity and the speeds that they need to really have the same opportunities as the rest of the country. So with the CARES Act that's already passed, if we look at that, we had $1.25 billion that goes to each state. Many of those states will be setting aside a part of that to have broadband initiatives and broadband deployments in their individual states. So there's a state opportunity. Recently, the House Democrats on the Energy and Commerce Committee have introduced legislation that, although it may not pass this year, sets out a very aggressive agenda of up to $100 billion to in some cases, 80 to 100 billion in broadband infrastructure funding over the next 5 years. And so those initiatives, both in the present and in the future, really demonstrate what I believe is the commitment of the country. Recently, Roger Wicker and Greg Walden, leading Republicans in the House and the Senate in the Commerce and Energy and Commerce Committees, have introduced a framework that we believe really addresses our member companies' needs during the COVID crisis. And that is a connectivity fund to reimburse companies that have kept the pledge known as Keep America Connected, that the FCC, the chairman of the FCC, Chairman Pai, asked broadband companies to take, so that those who might not be able to pay their bills, or the small businesses that couldn't stay open, wouldn't be disconnected during this time. And as we come out of the crisis and hopefully into recovery, the ability for our companies to be reimbursed for the losses that they've incurred and the duress that they've experienced during that time is very important. We're seeing an expansion with the Walden and Wicker framework of the E-rate programs, telemedicine, telehealth, to pay to replace the Huawei equipment and networks around the country, to rip it out and to replace it. For broadband mapping, the funding so that we do have good data going forward on where the unserved, underserved, and where the investments need to be made. So the next slide, so if you look at what is passed in the CARES Act, what is pending in the RDOF, which is the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, and Robert will go over in greater detail what we believe will be in the next auction that is scheduled for October of this year, and then will be carried out over the next 10 years, significant opportunities for our member companies. We also have a 5G fund that will really try to support in the wireless mobility and the deployments of fiber, small cell, and 5G, a fund that will also be targeting 5G deployments. The Connect America Fund is something through the U.S. Department of Agriculture that was passed in the Farm Bill. And for over the next 10 years, we'll see around $1 billion a year going in to rural markets. And so if you combine the CARES Act, the Farm Bill Act, another round of COVID legislation, and then what is happening with the 5G fund and RDOF, E-rate programs and telemedicine, it is really an opportunity for our companies. As Tom Cruise would say, show me the money in just a little bit. Robert will be able to show how to apply for the funding, what is the process for doing so, what are the criteria, what are the strategies, and what are the partnerships. So I'm looking forward for Robert to be able to go over that. As you go to the next slide, you'll see the eligible auction areas by state as it relates to the RDOF. We'll make all of this information available, through our website and through this webinar today, to make sure that you can look at your state and your markets and your region. Next slide, please. We could go to the, so these are some of the changes and the opportunity for rural and residential that as they look at the mapping currently, then upgrading and modernizing the maps. We hope over the next year to 2 years, and the funding that's in the COVID legislation to get good maps. You'll see the areas that will be eligible for RDOF. So we want to show you, the levels per state, then the maps that will give you where the initial round of auctions for the RDOF funding will be, and the maps that will show where you have underserved and unserved markets. So go to the next slide, please. and then I want to be able to turn it over to Ron to kind of kick things off from Uniti's perspective. And then as Robert can kind of go into the details of all the different programs. But Ron, thank you for really suggesting this webinar today, because I think it's very, very timely. This is a tremendous opportunity for our industry, our companies, and to form partnerships that are non-traditional in many cases, maybe with rural electric co-ops or others in rural America that are looking for those who are experienced and established in building broadband networks, and that can help them operate as they may be going into a new market or new experience for many of those types of entities. Ron, thank you, and I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Well, thank you, everyone. We just wanted to share some information about the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund that's going to be bid later this year. And we'll share this information so you have it available to you after the webinar. But wanted to just share some information, and then Robert's going to talk a little bit about our approach to it. Uniti's trying to participate in the opportunity as well. This page here comes from the FCC website. It has a few key dates on it about the process. We'll have more information on the next slide and as we go through the process. But it really kicks off here at the beginning of July with the initial application. If you want to participate in the bid, in the auction, you have to file the short form by July 15th. And that allows you to participate. The auction itself doesn't take place until October. And there will be a mock auction we'll cover on the next page. But you know, the main auction starts in October. It's going to be a reverse auction. Basically, what the structure is that there's census block groups that have been identified based on their need, and there's been a reserve price set by the FCC for each one of those. And so as long as people are bidding below that price, that they're bringing broadband at a lower price than or at least equal to or below the reserve price, then the funding can be available and the bidding stops when nobody's bidding again on the group. Go on to the next slide, please. A couple more dates on this this slide here. So you'll see that there is going to be a tutorial that'll be available from the FCC on October 14th. So most of the activity is going to take place planning for the auction between July and October. And of course, during that time, the people who have applied for it won't be able to talk to each other. You know, they won't be able to have any collusion or anything like that, the bidding rules. So it's important that you're aware of who else is bidding and not talking and maintaining the confidentiality during that period. But once the auction is concluded, then there's a long form that has to be filled out with more information for the winners, and then the funding will be following after that. Next slide, please. Down you can go. There you go. So this is the bidding matrix, and this comes from the FCC. And there's still some questions that we need to learn as we get further into this process. But basically, what they're looking for is to bring broadband with low latency out to these areas. And based on the bidding matrix here, a gig would be the preferred solution with less than 100 milliseconds of latency. And the way this works is that if unable to provide a gig, but you can provide 50 meg or 25 meg, then you can still qualify, but your pricing and your subsidy will be deducted the lower bandwidth that's provided. So somebody that can provide a gig at less than 100 milliseconds of latency, will get the full funding value. And those weightings on the right-hand side of the screen really are negative. So that if you're only providing 25 meg, then you're only eligible for 50% of the subsidy. And you can see the matrix and how it goes, between a gig and 100 and so forth. We're not quite sure how they're going to treat the categories in between. For example, if you're somewhere between 100 meg and 1 gig, what the scoring will be. We'll learn more about that as we get more information from the FCC. But clearly fixed wireless as well, obviously fiber to the home or fiber out there is going to be satisfactory, but obviously fixed wireless solutions and other technologies can also be used to meet these criteria. Any questions? I guess we're doing that later. So we can go on to the next slide, please. So how does Uniti plan to participate? You know, Uniti is not a residential provider. We don't provide residential service. You know, we're a middle mile solution. And so we feel that the best way that we can help the program and people that are bidding is to be a partner, to make our fiber and our services available to other bidders so that they can be more cost effective in trying to bring solutions out to these hard to serve areas. As you know, it's very difficult, you know, and costly to build out there. And so if somebody has to do an entire greenfield build, that's going to be more challenging than if they can work with someone that's already got infrastructure in the area or connected to it. So what Uniti does, what Uniti feels is that we can make our services available to all bidders, depending on who wins, and then help that party to implement. And we can provide lit or dark services to the lit or dark fiber services to the winners so that they don't have to do the greenfield build. We can provide the internet connection point back to the drain. So it can either be fiber in the census block group that's targeted or nearby it that can give connectivity back to, you know, main internet pop and other network hubs. And our feeling is that if we can come up with a success-based approach, something that helps the winning bidder better prepare their bid and not have as much cost in their proposal, they'll be able to provide either a better price to the residents or provide better coverage. And therefore, Uniti can also participate by being a partner to the underlying winner. Robert is going to show you some of the details of how we do that and where our fiber is relative to the census block groups in just a minute. You can go to the next slide. But I just wanted to tee up on this next slide. The white shaded area or the light areas here are the areas that are these targeted census block groups in the southeast. And you can see it's very vast. Of course, this is an area that's very rural, as would make sense. And you know, does not have as much infrastructure in it. So we feel that by having existing middle mile infrastructure that runs right through these, even though we may not have the last mile out to the residents, it can help other bidders to target these areas and bring service to them. Go ahead and go to the next page. Next slide, please. So this is Uniti's network, and you can see that we're very dense, especially in the eastern half of the country. And what we've done is we've mapped our fiber network relative to these census block groups that are targeted in the auction to see which ones, you know, we already have coverage or we're nearby that we could provide coverage to the winning bidder. And Robert's going to go through and explain some analysis that we've done and how we've looked at how we can help to bring this infrastructure available to you who may be a potential bidder in the auction. Robert.
Thanks, Ron, and thanks, Chip. You know, look, I just want to start as Chip had said. You know, this is going to be. Please go back one slide, if you would. This is going to be an interesting opportunity. I don't think you'll ever see, you know, more money coming into this space, you know, generationally than what's going into it today. It's a problem that needs solving. It needs solving in the worst way. And you know, just to paraphrase a discussion that I had a few years ago with a parish president, you know, in Louisiana where I live, it's equivalent to a county everywhere else in the country. We had a parish president in a rural county, you know, speak to us. I was on the governor of Louisiana's broadband team a few years ago, and you know, he basically said, look, you know, we have a serious problem in the rural parts of our country. You know, we can't participate in the digital economy, and you know, especially in the context of our current situation with COVID, you know, people are working from home. If you don't have broadband out in these areas, it's hard to even work. So it's a problem that we as a country would really like to solve, and we at Uniti, as you can see from our map, have a pretty good amount of network. And we wanted to try and come up with a way that we could make that available to folks that we could provide services to, as Ron said, to lower their bids and to be more competitive, and hopefully to get services to some of these folks that are stranded out in these very rural areas. And I think the federal, state, and local governments have kind of worked together to try and make this situation work. So flip the slide for me, please, if you would. The next slide that you will see is effectively the census block groups turned on. So the entire area that's shaded either gray or lime green is in that slide. And again, this is just focused on the Southeast United States. We have similar maps for the rest of the country, but it gets a little too busy when you go much larger. What we did is we looked at our network that you saw on the previous slide, and we said, okay, what areas, what CBGs, census block groups, or auction polygons can we at Uniti effectively serve? So we looked at them. We said, okay, our network goes through a number of these polygons, and so we picked areas that were within a half a mile of our fiber network, and we turned those a different color and kind of did some analysis on where the opportunity is for us, and we wanted to make that available to folks that are looking at bidding and seeing if they could leverage our network to reduce their costs and put together a better lower cost bid and be effective. So flip the slide again, please. So the next slide, we've basically just removed the areas that Uniti is not a good fit for. Again, there may be other providers that can help you get out of those areas, and look, we'd be happy to have anybody anywhere else. This is a little bit bigger map. We're showing the more of the eastern part of the country, and as you can see, we have, as Ron said, we have a lot of density in the southeast, and we have quite a bit of density in the Midwest. So that's a lot of area. These again, these are very rural areas, but we might be able to connect you in one of those areas and either stitch multiple census block groups that you're planning on bidding on, or take a particular one back to an internet drain site or to a POP or an aggregation facility where you could you have to be able to pump sunshine into these areas. And so we think that we're a good choice to be able to help do that. And as you can see, we don't cover, we can't be everything to everybody, but we do have a lot of network, and it goes into some places that are pretty remote, and we're not taking full advantage of that today. So next slide, please. The next slide, what you're going to see is some electric co-ops in Mississippi. This is a zoomed in picture of kind of central Mississippi. And in January, the Mississippi governor signed the Broadband Enabling Act, allowing electrical co-ops and electrical power companies in Mississippi to participate in this broadband money. Many of these folks who have been prohibited from getting into that business, they are members of these communities. Most of these folks live in these communities. They want to find ways to provide services to their communities, now they are not barred from doing so. So in my job, I work with electric co-ops and electric companies in the Southeast primarily. So we've contacted quite a few of these folks and have figured out ways to do it. And one of the things, and I think Chip touched on it briefly, some of these folks want to do the full Monty. They want to provide the services all the way to the end, and the support that goes along with it, and are going to learn how to do that and how to deploy it in an appropriate manner. But a lot of them, need some help. A lot of them need partners, from folks like ourselves that know a little bit about providing, internet services and telecommunication services to these customers. And so I think there's an opportunity for some partnerships to utilize the tools that they have, to work up in the utility areas of the telephone poles or power poles to provide services, and some of that stuff, you know, it's going to require some partnerships with the state governments, with the local governments, and with the electric co-ops, power companies, cable folks, and so forth to you know, to make this a reality in some of these areas. If you flip to the next slide, please. So to help do that, Uniti is working on a success-based pricing model, and you know, so what does that mean? Next slide, please. So, you know, as Ron said, we're going to work on middle mile or transit bandwidth out of those locations, either, you know, to the internet or to a designated meet point, you know, in or near that area, so we can stitch together multiple CBGs and you know, allow you guys to build networks that can serve those areas. And the way we're approaching this, which is a little unique, you know, when you first roll this stuff out, you know, you're not going to have a whole lot of customers in some of these very rural areas, so there's not going to be a lot of revenue other than the subsidy. So we wanted to come up with a success-based model that was based on the number of locations serviced or subsidized in a particular census block group, which is the auction polygon, and you know, we'll put some limits on it with some pre-negotiated thresholds that say, okay, if you serve this area and you get over a certain, you know, bandwidth capacity, will trigger a rate. But for the most part, it will be commensurate with the amount of subsidy that you're getting or the number of locations that you're serving, which is a unique pricing model in our industry. And we want to help, and we want to make sure that you know, people can get to these really small areas where, you know, there's a minimal amount of folks, and you know, you just can't afford to bring a giant pipe in, even though that's what you'd have to do to be able to bid. But we think that by us pricing it based on the load, as opposed to you know, just a flat rate based on the capacity, that it's going to allow you to be competitive in these very small markets, and even in the denser ones, just because of the time shifting of when the revenue comes on. We also can provide indivisible rights of use, or IRUs, and or leased dark fiber where we have capacity available. So you can even use that for some of your middle mile and some of your delivery, you know, to not have to overbuild large swaths of network. And so we're going to offer those. You know, we can't do that on a stratified success-based pricing, but we will be able to do that at commercially competitive rates, and we're willing to look at pretty much any place that we have network, and as long as it doesn't strand too much capacity, we'll make it available. And so, you know, the deal is it'll allow you to reduce your capital cost, you know, for the middle mile construction, and you know, and the design thereof. So next slide, please. So, you know, what I've added on to the end, and in our travels and in talking around the industry, we've come across a bunch of different resources that you know, you kind of need to have. You know, one of the hardest things about this is, you know, it's a giant game, and name that tune, you know, with the reverse auction, and so everybody's trying to figure out how cheaply can I provide this service, because I'm competing with, you know, allegedly other folks who are trying to do the same thing. So getting control of your costs, knowing what your costs are going to be, are incredibly important. And so I wanted to put some of the different companies that provide the different services. And this is by no means an exhaustive list. It's just a few folks that I've run into in my travels that have teams that are focused on this auction 904, this RDOF money. So you know, there's some folks that have contact that may be able to provide you even more detailed information than what we've done here for you today. So I'll just take you through them real briefly, and then again, it's going to be available on the site, and you know, the folks whose names are on these slides have, you know, information about RDOF and some knowledge, and are staring at the problem very, very carefully. So if you would, flip to the next slide. I've got a list of GPON equipment vendors who make the GPON equipment for fiber to the home. And again, you know, not that that's a preferred solution, but if you saw earlier in Ron's slide, the way the auction is situated, it penalizes you pretty heavily if you don't have either you know, a 1 gig by 500 meg asymmetrical service, which kind of, you know, limits the amount, the different types of technologies you can use. Obviously, GPON is a very popular one for providing that level of service, or some kind of hybrid fiber wireless solution, or you know, or you know, hybrid fiber coax with the DOCSIS 3.1 or better you know, cable modem. So you know, there's a number of ways to get to the maximum subsidy and provide the minimum service required to do so. We you know, we looked at GPON and think we put quite a bit of this in our network, and it's a good solution. So here's a list of vendors. This list is a little dated, so some of these guys may not be you know, may not be doing this anymore. This came from light reading from a few years ago. So flip to the next slide, please. Walker and Associates, again, a equipment supplier and logistics company. They do design, they do engineering, they do, you know, sourcing for equipment. You can go ahead and flip through these pretty quick if you don't mind, Andrew. So, you know, they sell some of the equipment you found on the GPON, structured cabling systems. You know, they can, you know, I mean, many of you who probably deal with these folks or folks like them, but if you don't, they have an RDOF team who's been looking at this for quite some time now. Next slide, please. These guys are a company called CostQuest. They're out in Seattle, and they have done some of the academic work to try and figure out where the physical locations are. So, you know, one of the problems in solving you know, this Rubik's Cube, if you will, is that there's a lot of data available, and you know, the FCC publishes a list of how many sites they believe need to be served in these underserved areas, and sometimes that data is very good, and sometimes it's not so good. These guys at CostQuest have done a lot of work on getting data, aggregating data from a number of different sources and using it to kind of clean itself up to figure out where the service locations that you need to serve are. And so that if once you've figured out, okay, you know, these are the you know, I mean, look, we've done some work on this, and when we look at these rural areas, there's a lot of farm roads and things like that. You can't use address data because they're mail stops instead of physical addresses. It's very hard to figure out, you know, how you're going to pick the right locations so that you can design a network that you know, builds the minimum cost network to serve the maximum number of sites, or the required number of sites in the case of the RDOF auction, to be able to get this stuff turned on. We've done some work with these folks. We found that they have very good data, and they have a very good process to figure out where the service locations are. And when you know where the good, you know, precise, you know, locations are, you can do a much better job of figuring out what your costs are going to be. So next slide, please. Vetro is another mapping company. They do they have a tool that can help you, you know, build a map and figure out how to design a network that's gonna serve these locations. And again, if you kind of pick pieces, and look, most of these guys in my travels, they all know about each other. They've all, you know, have kind of operating, you know, deals between them. So you could, you know, potentially pick CostQuest for some of the data, buy the data from them, and use Vetro to you know, to help design your mapping. And again, you know, Uniti, we have our own tool. We have a multi-site routing tool that we use, you know, for bidding on multi-site complex, you know, projects for cell carriers and large E-rate projects. You know, these products are very similar. Vetro, you know, has a do-it-yourself project that you can buy an access license to get on their site and you know, put in your geolocated data, and it'll build you a pro forma map that you can cost off of. So it's a pretty interesting product and help you figure out what your costs are going to be so you can put in an effective bid. Flip the next slide, please. And then, you know, we've been working with the folks at Commscope. Commscope, excuse me, one more slide if you would. This is a picture of their mapping tool. Commscope is a cable company, certainly, you know, fiber optic cable company, and many more things. They sell, you know, pretty much soup to nuts, structured cabling systems, the actual fiber cable itself, wireless. They own a company called Ruckus that sells some pretty interesting wireless gear. Some of the stuff, I haven't looked at their product suite for a while, but they even at one point had a cable-based, basically a wireless access point that you could hang up on the telephone wire and provide services to the end customer. So, you know, again, no endorsement of a particular technology or solution. I just wanted to include some of these out here so you could get an idea of some folks that have some of the pieces that you might need to put together a solution that fits the puzzle. And these are some folks that have been you know, have some experience and have worked in the RDOF space, have been watching it and trying to figure out how to best put bids together. So again, you know, we're going to go to the question and answer next, and you know, happy to take questions and see if you know, we can provide some value for you.
Thank you, Robert. I really appreciate you guys presenting your material to our viewers. And unfortunately, we haven't had any questions come in, so I would like to remind everyone that is watching to please submit through our chat box. Right now, we'd be able to take questions, and we have plenty of time for our panelists. So with no questions, though, I'll try to throw a few at you and hopefully be some softball questions. And Chip, if you have any too, feel free to step in and help me out if you'd like. But just one question. I mean, Ron, you had mentioned partnering with underlying winners. If you can speak a little bit to that process and kind of the best approach when you do lose on a bid, kind of what happens from the company, from, you know, your perspective, and what do you recommend on how to kind of go about that?
Sure. Well, what we want to do is try to make as many bidders successful as they can be. They may bid in different states or different regions within a state. And, you know, we can work with multiple bidders because of the nature of our middle mile network. And so what we would do is work with the potential partner to make them, give them the tools that they need to know where our network is, how to access it, and how we can structure something to serve the particular region that they're targeting. And as Robert said during his presentation, we're trying to make this a success-based approach where, you know, our infrastructure is available, but the cost of it is really more variable based upon the success of the winner. You know, one of the problems with, you know, almost any network is you have a lot of fixed costs up front. You know, your revenue grows over time, so it's, you know, hard to justify projects when you have a high upfront fixed costs or capital costs. And so we try to remove that by making the existing infrastructure available, either through dark fiber or through lit services and internet connectivity. And what that does is allow the bidder to know, okay, we've got our internet, our transport, our middle mile, you know, handled, so we can now focus our design on the last mile and the other parts of the network that they need to try to build. And so we can do that really with multiple bidders during the period of time before the auction starts, between July and in October. Now, of course, bidders can't talk to each other; they're restricted. But, you know, Uniti is not going to be a bidder, so we can talk to multiple parties and provide them the mapping and the routing information that Robert talked about on how to use our network to help lower their costs. And that's really, I think, the key is to, you know, use as much infrastructure as you can that's already in existence, rather than have to have that greenfield build cost.
Great, thank you. Just another question I had just on top of my head. Robert, you alluded to the utilities and electric co-ops. Can you speak a little bit more on kind of the partnerships with state and local, and what you see maybe that can be done to improve the relationships, and what you think moving forward on their front that can help your business?
Sure. And in our part of the world, we deal, government is one of my, government and utilities are both in my spaces, and we're seeing a lot of interests from the politicians trying to figure out how can, they obviously realize that this is maybe once in a lifetime opportunity to get that investment into these rural areas, and make that happen for the folks in their constituents in their states and areas. So I'll give you an example. In Alabama, there's a group of senators that are trying to get as many of these shovel-ready projects going today to get some of that money to work. And look, the Congress put the money there to stimulate the economy. And so a lot of it has to be spent by the end of this year, or at least earmarked by the end of this year. So, we're having a lot of conversations with a lot of different folks on, how to participate, and how to start putting this, putting shovels in the ground and putting network on, into operations to solve this problem. During the COVID, I'll give you an example. During the COVID crisis, we've got a combination of things. We've got kids trying to work from home. We've got homework gap issues. They're two similar problems, but they don't necessarily, they are somewhat mutually exclusive. And let me try and get to that for a second. So we've had school districts who, see this $1.65 billion of CARES Act money, and they're saying, hey, how can we use this to solve this homework gap problem? We want to get our guys out in these rural areas access to broadband so they can do their homework and they can participate remotely in school when they can't be in classrooms. And, it's kind of a conundrum of a problem when you look at it individually. When you look at it and say, okay, I'm going to bring a cable out here and I'm going to hook up, this household out in the middle of nowhere, and, allow them to get access to the schools. So E-rate program dropped the rules and said you can now open your networks up. So schools and libraries have opened their broadband networks up for the students to come literally sit in the parking lot, which is it's heartbreaking when you see a bunch of cars parked around a fire station or a library or a community center or a school, doing their homework in their automobile. And that's assuming they even have automobiles. So it's really it's an opportunity to go help these communities. And I think when you look at what the money that's available, I think it's I don't know that it's all going to get done, but there's certainly some areas that make a lot of sense. And where there's now, with this additional funding, some business opportunities to make some money. And there's a huge amount of, I had a state rep from Louisiana call me up and say, what can we do to make this easier on guys like you? What are we going to do? And so one of the things that I had suggested to him is, he says, look, what if we just give you some money? I was like, well, you don't need to give us money. You just need to figure out how to remove some of the hurdles that we have to get over to make this happen. If you want to, give us some tax abatement on the taxes on this network, that's going to lower our cost. If you want to, give us some reprieve from some of the franchise fees that are in that space as well. That can help us reduce the cost of building and operating these networks, and that's going to make it. And I told him, I said, look, you don't have to do it in a high dense metro area where there's 17 providers and a lot of capacity already. But in these places, especially the ones that are in these RDOF polygons, if you want to use the federal government's mapping and designation as a mechanism to reduce the cost to go into those areas, you won't be rewarding people who have already done it and don't need to be rewarded. You're going to reward the ones that are going to go solve the problem. And so, those are the kinds of things. And again, we have these conversations and are having these conversations, as I'm sure many, the rest of you are, on a daily basis, and trying to figure out how to stitch together. There's no right or wrong answer. There's no blueprint for success here. And so, we at Uniti just said, look, we've got a lot of network in a lot of obscure places that we are not going to be able to take advantage of. If we make this available in such a way that it, helps cooperate and participate and lower the cost, it's going to make more of this happen. And so that's kind of the way that this is all kind of falling together. I hope that answered your question.
Great. Thank you, Robert. Chip, I don't know if you just want to close out, and if you have any short-term or long-term takeaways of Congress and any additional funding from future legislation, how it's going to impact things moving forward.
First, I want to thank Robert and Ron. I hope this is opening those who are watching this webinar as we distribute it to our members and other companies, that it opens your eyes to the opportunity. Robert the other day had totaled up all of the different funding initiatives that are projected out over the next 10 years. And it caught me by surprise that just with what is now pending and proposed, and in the process, $165 billion. I believe that's right. That Robert is correct. And so for our industry, if you look at the private investment combined with what is now going to be made available through public funding, it's a tremendous opportunity. And what Robert has laid out today and Ron is really, I don't want to overuse the word map, but they've given a blueprint and a model and the map of how to go through each stage of the process to know the different programs and the initiatives, and then the private sector partners that I think can really help rural communities use this funding to build the networks that will really connect their communities and the families and the businesses in those communities to the broadband that really is essential for everyone's future going forward. And so Robert and Ron, I really appreciate the time that y'all took to do this and to put all of the slides together and the information, because I believe it's really valuable for our member companies and those who are watching today. And the other thing that I was struck by is just the partnering opportunities. You mentioned rural co-ops and electric utilities. When we passed the 1996 Telecommunications Act, I was first on Senate staff and then as a member of Congress. And the hope 25 years ago was that the electric utilities really would enter in and help us build the broadband networks in rural America. That hope, I think, is just now coming to fruition. And Robert, I wish you the best as Uniti, and Ron the best as y'all try to partner with the rural co-ops around the states and where your networks exist. I think that's a tremendous opportunity. And to close, I just again want to make this available to all of our members on the web, and we can distribute. I think it's excellent information, and I hope everyone has enjoyed the webinar today. Ron, Robert, thank you very much for putting this together and for being great members of INCOMPAS.
Thanks, Chip and Andrew. Appreciate it.